Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I am Deepak, your host from India. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Carol Graham, Senior Fellow in the Economic Studies Program at Brookings, College Park Professor at the University of Maryland, and Senior Scientist at Gallup, as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Professor Carroll is a leading economist and author whose work explores the intersection of well-being, inequality, and public policy. She has written widely acclaimed books such as The Power of Hope and Happiness for All, alongside numerous earlier work on economic reform, development, and quality of life. A prolific scholar, her research appears in top journals including Science and Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. Dr. Graham has served as an advisor to leading global institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and the United Nations. She currently serves on the UN High-Level Expert Group on metrics beyond GDP. Her contributions to well-being research have earned her major honors, including a Pioneer Award and Lifetime Distinguished Scholar Award. Born in Peru and educated at Princeton, Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and Oxford, she brings a global perspective to her work. She is also a senior editor, policy advisor, and frequent media commentator on issues of happiness, inequality, and social progress. In today's episode, Dr. Carol Graham shares key insights from her prominent book, Happiness for All, Unequal Hopes and Lives in Pursuit of the American Dream. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Graham to the conversation. Professor Carol, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. Happy to do it, and always like to talk about my books. Although the research in this one's not very optimistic, but I'll try and look at the good side too.
Thank you, Professor. The book opens with the American promise of the pursuit of happiness. How does your research challenge the idea that this pursuit is equally attainable for all Americans today?
Unfortunately, that is the case. For a long time, we were, and this is well before the current administration, it's sort of just a whole different level of craziness. But, for several decades, our intergenerational mobility rates have been falling, not rising. So we used to be have this pride in being the land of opportunity, and anybody who migrated here or was in poverty could work hard and get ahead. And that's very much changed. It's changed over time for any number of reasons. Some of them structural economic change, the increasing role of technology-driven growth, the threats to labor markets from AI. There are also opportunities from AI, but people get impacted differentially. But I mean, one of the biggest, the decline in manufacturing, which has also affected lots of other, working classes in countries around the world, particularly in wealthy countries in a way, as manufacturing, that's kind of, first you industrialize and then you deindustrialize. And, there's more variation, I think, in developing countries, although the challenge is still there. But here, you have a couple of things in the U.S. that are unique to the U.S. One is that because, unfortunately, there's still a lot of latent racism, a lot of discrimination. For many years, the good working class jobs were, whites had privileged access to them. And minorities and immigrants, and as you know, I'm one, having been born in Peru, not a disadvantaged one, but I have an American father and Peruvian mother and whatever. And when we came to the U.S. when I was just 3, it still was very, we were seen as different, and that's from being in an advantaged position with a father who was at Johns Hopkins, School of Medicine. But so for a long time, the the good working class jobs were basically held by working class whites, and they were not jobs you needed to go to college for, right? You with a public high school education and maybe some vocational training, just there was a track to a stable life, right? And respected life. The manufacturing communities often were built around whatever the firm was, right? But there was a whole community behind it. So there were mom and pop shops, or there were Lions clubs, or there were labor unions that kind of were the the pillars of communities. And working that there was primarily men, but working class white working class men may not have had glamorous jobs, but they had respect and they had stable jobs. So, uh, in the meantime, immigrants and minorities realized that the only way they could get ahead was to get educated, right? Because they needed to fight harder for jobs, and so there are lots of for a lot of reasons. Then, when the manufacturing communities declined, you had a huge sort of increase in what we call deaths of despair, premature mortality due to drug overdose, suicide, alcohol poisoning. And for a long time, for the first, decade or two that we were aware of this problem, um, it was concentrated among middle-aged working class white men and women, but more men than women. And minorities were sort of not part of that epidemic, if you can call it that. And yet that has now changed since about 2015. You started seeing younger people and minorities now represented in those deaths, and it's for the same reason. There's just huge uncertainty about what the future of jobs are. Young people have no idea what their life is going to be like. I mean, even if you graduate from college now, it's not clear what kind of job you'll get. So there's a lot. And then you overlay on that the um, increases in inequality, which have been accompanied by increases in political inequality, right? You have these like hyper rich that are in control of both tech firms and also politics in a way, because they're very big donors. Um, and so you get a real kind of change in what used to be um, more coherent societies, albeit with some discrimination. But um, Robert Putnam, who's a famous sociologist, wrote a book called Our Kids in about 2012, and he talked about what was happening in the U.S. in part was a privatization, not just of industry, but of society. What has Putnam described the privatization of American society, in which previously, where he grew up in Ohio. That's just a classic, Midwestern place. And everybody went to the same public school. They all went to the same, they played on the same sports teams. They went to the same birthday parties or whatever, just typical kids. So rich kids and poor kids, didn't matter where they were from. There were these public institutions that were kind of common to everybody. But now, with the kind of and I have several other colleagues that have written a lot on kind of what this drive for more and more wealth is done. So now the rich kids go to private schools and they play on travel sports teams that the poor kids can't afford to play on. They have different birthday parties that poor kids couldn't even afford. And so it kind of even starts at that level. And so it's created more and more social division. So that's all of those things kept striking me. And the other thing that made me write Happiness for All, or that inspired me to write Happiness for All, was that for a long time, traveling a lot, growing up between Peru and the US, I always loved Peru and the joie de vivre and just, lots of family and music and great food. But I did always come back to the US and go, well, we have a stable democracy and a stable economy. And that's kind of not so much anymore, right? And what really struck me more than anything during, say, this was from, say, the year 2000 on that things are changing was the big difference between the optimism of the poor in Latin America, who were materially more poor than the poor in the US. It's easier to be poor in a warm climate with less things, of course, but still, materially, they were very poor. Um, and the kind of hopelessness and the stigmatizing of the poor. So we are the only wealthy country in the world that does not have national health insurance, that people that are on safety nets are stigmatized. You know, the universal programs like Social Security and Medicare for the old, you get your benefits in a check. But poor people who need cash assistance, for example, um, are they have to go to terribly run offices where they have to wait days to get, register and get their benefits. And often they're single parents, have a sick kid. Then if they lose their job, they lose their health insurance because our health insurance is linked to your job. There's no national health insurance. So there's sort of a vicious cycle that sends a lot of people into poverty. And then, you go on, there are different other systems that in a way discriminate against the poor. Our banking system, overdraft fees are bigger for poor people who are more likely to overdraft because they don't have enough money. And yet, people with big bank accounts have concierge banking so there's sort of this gradual stratification of society that has really, changed things much for the worse, but it's also affected our politics. So the political backlash you see, the support for Donald Trump and the kind of the blaming immigrants for everything, the kind of really divisive politics has also sprung from picking up on the desperation of people, right? Politicians who are able to do that. And it exists in other parts of the world. And I mean, I grew up in Peru, and politics there could be crazy. We had our share of populists and all sorts of stuff. But it's kind of now really created, I think, very deep divisions in our society. So that really, I wanted to understand what was driving this sort of loss of hope and digging more and more. And I'd been looking at mobility rates for a long time, social mobility, economic mobility, intergenerational mobility, and just watching the data, reading the data that showed it was going for each generation since, say, the 1950s, it's been harder to have a better life than your parents. And now it's almost impossible. And so the US is unfortunately no longer the land of opportunity, and there are some people that come and make it, or some, very creative entrepreneurs that 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 make it big. There also, we used to have unparalleled paths to good science careers and making big innovations in medical science. And unfortunately, that's being destroyed by the federal government now. So it's what I wrote about, that book I published in 2017 is now in spades worse. So I'm supposed to think about the positive side of this story, but I'm having difficulty. Anyway,
Yeah.
so that's the start, probably too long of one.
Yeah. Professor, you describe an optimism gap between rich and poor. How do you measure that gap, and why does it matter so much for the future of the American dream?
Well, there's a big gap between the rich and the poor, but it turns out it's much bigger for poor whites and rich whites than poor blacks and wealthy blacks, and poor immigrants and wealthy immigrants. So at the low levels of income, the least hopeful group or optimistic are poor whites for many of the reasons I've discussed. And poor minorities and immigrants have more hope or more optimism. They're a little bit different in terms of concepts. I think more hope, which also thinks it can still do something to make their lives better. And you have a lot of poor whites in deep despair, which, it's a situation where you don't care if you live or die. So that's when people vote for crazy politicians or, do things that risk their lives. Versus poor minorities have both, because they've always believed they have to invest in education. There's still that strong belief. And there's also both African Americans and Latin Americans, which are the two communities I focus most on, but also Asian communities, have more sort of informal social structures that create really important social ties. Um, so it's there's kind of a big difference in how people cope, and also minorities and immigrants usually have somebody in their family that's fallen behind. They never believed that there was this fabulous dream that everything would just work out, right? So they have more empathy for people who fall behind. The Anglo-Saxon, sort of the white two two parents, two kids model, right? Where you have a working dad and a stay-at-home mom, and the kids are happy and go off to great public schools. That's gone, right? And on top of it, poor whites have much more difficulty sort of multitasking or because their fathers didn't do that. There's kind of versus minorities and immigrants have always had to do that. So this is nothing new. But I think a huge reason is that there is support. They have strong communities. I've interviewed adolescents, not for this book, but for the next book, in low-income neighborhoods in Missouri, which is sort of a state that's right in the middle and has every problem the U.S. possibly could have, right? And it turned out and I interviewed adolescents who were just finishing high school and making choices about whether they went on for more education. It could be vocational training, it didn't have to be college, or they just, whatever. So the poor white kids all said they weren't, like not all, but 99% of my respondents said they weren't going to pursue higher education, and their parents actively didn't support them pursuing higher education, which just left me almost speechless, and how consistent that was. These kids were clearly hardworking and very self-reliant, but they didn't have a clue what the labor market that was facing them looked like. Versus the poor minorities and immigrants had somebody in their family or their community that supported them in trying to achieve more education and trying to, do better. And it was incredibly consistent, that finding, and it's been replicated in bigger data. And why optimism matters. I now have much larger scale studies about it, and hope even more than optimism, because in my next book, in the Hope and Despair book, I talk more about the differences between optimism and hope. So optimism is just kind of a belief that things will get better, but hope is a belief and agency, that you have a sense of agency that you can make your life better, right? And so people with higher levels of hope, they're less likely to take risky behaviors because they don't want to they believe they have a future, right? They don't want to jeopardize their future. They're more likely to invest in their education because that's, gives them agency. They do better in labor markets. They actually live longer because they're less likely to, they're more likely to take care of their health because of, their future. They're more likely to have strong social ties. So you start to see and it's, if the comparison group is people in despair, it's that people in despair lack all those things, right? But you can look at the positive side of it and try and understand it better. I've looked a lot at the negative side, the despair side, and I realized I needed to understand kind of why hope mattered in my next book after this one. And it turns out it matters a lot, and it matters for, genuine reasons. And we just did a study, nationally representative longitudinal survey in Australia. It's called the Hilda survey. So we were able to follow people for 20 years and look at their hope levels in, early on, and their life outcomes 20 years later. And again, very remarkable patterns. And also people with higher levels of hope were much better able to weather negative shocks, whether they were say, you know, you you lost your job because you didn't perform well or whatever, so kind of self-imposed, or whether they were random, like a natural disaster or the death of a spouse or a child. They were able to adapt to those negative shocks faster and return to their previous levels of hope and continue to pursue their lives much more than people with low levels of hope. And if you think about the people in despair in the US, they've just lost a sense of agency. They've lost the sense they can do anything to make their lives better. They've lost their self-esteem. And all of that plays out in bad outcomes. And right now we are a very divided society. And I'd say there are three divisions now, not just two, not just sort of those in despair and those who have hope for the future, not just the rich and the poor, but it's more like the ultra rich and the rest of society. The kind of almost rich people obviously do better than the poor people, but there's still like a whole other layer where, people, they're in private planes. They have completely different worlds that they live in, and they control politics. So the whole thing is, a long way of answering lots of reasons I think America is no longer the land of opportunity.
Sure, sure. Professor, you show that the language people use differs sharply by income group. The rich using words tied to learning and healthy habits, the poor using words of desperation and short-term fixes. What did those word patterns tell you about people's inner lives and expectations?
I think it tells the story of what I talked about early on, that poor people they're so vulnerable to negative shocks that they live from day to day, right? It's very difficult to plan for the future if you just lost your health insurance, you have a sick kid, so you lose you can't get another job. And if you go on disability insurance, you aren't allowed to look for a job. So the whole thing is wacko. It's a very complicated welfare system, just with a whole lot of negative incentives in it. So, or think about it, in the US too, also, people have to drive everywhere. We don't have good public transportation. So your car breaks down if you're poor. You can't get to your bad quality job where you have to you have to ticket and clock in and clock out. You lose that job within a week, right? Or you work in the gig economy where you have no benefits, but if your car breaks down, you can't drive your car and drive an Uber, and your car has to pass certain standards to drive an Uber. But poor people again, and then the banking system tends to penalize those with low balances. So if they get overdraft charges, their balance just gets lower. It's sort of a cycle. It's a vicious cycle. Versus the rich can think about the future. The ultra rich don't even think about a college tuition that's $65,000, $70,000 a year. And now, the middle class can't even fathom affording that, right? So, so the words very much describe kind of what I was talking about as broader trends. So the words people use are, all about quick fixes versus, having a luxury life where you can afford to go on vacation. And if you don't have to wait in line for anything, whether it's to get on an airplane or to you even have their different toll lines for people that are willing to pay, for faster commuting routes. So it's just, unfortunately, it's sort of now built in, just more and more ingrained in almost every facet of society. The quality of healthcare that people get. Yes, we have some of the best healthcare in the world. My dad was a medical doctor in the, teaching in the medical school. But to get into Hopkins now, to Johns Hopkins, you need connections. You need to be able to pay all these different fees that, insurance won't cover. It's very unlikely unless there's some stroke of luck or something, that a very low income person is ever going to be able to go there, right? So there's just the whole thing is kind of the books are cooked, unfortunately, more and more.
Professor, many listeners might assume that more income always brings more happiness. Based on your findings, when does inequality start to erode well-being instead of motivating people to get ahead?
A very good question. So there is a link between income and happiness. So people who are destitute, who can't, afford to um, to feed their children or uh, you know, make any kind of choice in their lives because they're just living from day to day, right? So um, they're going to be less happy, have lower levels of life satisfaction than others. I mean, they may be happy at certain moments, but if you think about life satisfaction as kind of an evaluation of your whole life, um, having, being able to choose what you want to do, having meaning and purpose in life really matters, and that matters as much as, if not more than income, once you have enough income to meet basic needs and to invest in your kids and to invest, in your future without living day to day. So when does it matter? It's complex. I mean, from that point of view, it's clearly it would vary by every society's kind of income level and price level, but essentially people who cannot afford basic needs and education and health are going to be much less happy than others. But after a certain point, if you have the ability to have a decent and stable life in whatever society you live, we find that, the effect of more and more income is marginal, right? It's kind of like a concave curve. If you think in economic terms, that after a while, more income doesn't get you more and more happiness. The other very good part of your question is, okay, how does inequality kick in? So there's what inequality signals matters a lot. So in the US before, it was very much like a famous article written by Albert Hirschman, who's a very famous economist, called the tunnel effect of inequality. And he said inequality is like a traffic jam in a tunnel. If everybody's stuck in the same lane, or all the lanes, everybody's frustrated. When they see one lane move, and you can probably relate to this from just being in a traffic jam, right? But in a tunnel, you can't really see far ahead, so you can't see what's going on. But one lane first, when it moves, it gives you hope that you too can move, right? That's when inequality sort of has a positive incentive effect. But if that lane keeps going and your lane stays stalled, you get really mad and you want to jump the median into the other lane. You want to protest, right? So that's kind of where inequality has sort of um, you can't pinpoint the exact level of inequality that will produce unhappiness because it so much depends on what it signals. Now, in the US, people for a long time weren't bothered by inequality well after mobility rates had fallen, but the average person on the street still believed, it was the land of the dream, and if you worked hard, you could. But now you have a huge change of sentiment. I work a lot with Gallup, as you know, a new Gallup poll that showed that, the percent of Americans who think they have an opportunity to get ahead if they work hard has fallen dramatically over, say, 10 years, and particularly since 2025. And then there's a whole other kind of less easy to document, but important to mention of inequality, which is that people care about equity. They don't, there's there are all kinds of, it's more in smaller scale surveys or experiments, but when you offer to give people money, there's that famous experiment called the ultimatum game. So the person says, look, I have $100. I'm going to divide it. You get 10 and the other gets 90. But then the person, or neither of you gets anything unless you agree. So the person getting the lower level of income will decline up to a large amount of money, like almost $1,000. And these are experiments with students, but it's very much, people get very upset about unfairness. And I think there's a lot of that going on now. And then the other thing that the income happiness, the standard, oh, income makes you happy. It also forgets that people have other qualities. Altruists, for example, are happier than not, right? Than those who aren't altruistic, because they get joy out of giving back to others, right? Social relationships matter more than money. Good health matters more than money. Now, money and health are very connected, so it's very difficult to disentangle those two. But so a lot of things, so inequality is just, um, it's it's gotten to the point in the U.S. that it's certainly not, it's not creating incentives anymore. It's creating disincentives more than anything else. But again, if you look at the alternative, which no longer really exists, but in the former communist societies, people lacked incentive to get ahead because everything was equal, no matter what you did, and that didn't go very well either. So there's sort of a balance. And I know in Latin America, in some countries, they've managed to reduce inequality a fair amount through certain things like conditional cash transfers and slightly better fiscal policy. And it's made a difference. Unfortunately, the U.S. has gone in the opposite direction. Like conditional cash transfers are, you give people below a certain level of income just cash, right, that they can spend. And the only condition is that they send their kids to school and take them to the health post or the doctor, once for a checkup once a year. So it's basically said, if you invest in your family, we trust you to spend whatever support we give you any way that makes sense. It turns out that works very well. I have a PhD student that just did a study of the expansion of the child tax credit in the US, which is one of the few benefits that we have for children in poverty. And under Biden, it was expanded a lot during COVID because so many people were unemployed and there were a lot of problems. And the opponents of the child tax credit, which is the same attitude that drives the complexity of the US welfare system, were convinced parents would spend it on what they called vice goods. Oh, they're going to spend it on alcohol and, drugs and all this crap. Well, it turned out my PhD students' very good research found that that's not what they spent it at all. They spent it on their kids, I'm sure there were some abusers, probably, 1 in 100 parents didn't spend it the right way, but 99% did, right? And our social welfare system spends more time keeping people, administering or thinking of ways to check to make sure people are spending the benefits the right way than they spend on benefits. So it's just backwards, right? It's so yeah, and that's why our levels of inequality are unusually high, because in other wealthy countries, if you have national health insurance, you lose your job, you don't fall into poverty. The tax system is much more, we have the least equitable tax system of all wealthy countries. So again, we're creating what we call destructive inequality. There's kind of constructive inequality, which is what I was talking about. At a certain level, you need some inequality, so there are incentives to get ahead, right? But then it's a point becomes destructive, and I think that's where we are.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. You end the book hoping that well-being metrics can help restore the pursuit of happiness for all. If you had to prioritize, what is one policy change or one measurement change you would implement first to move us in that direction?
Well, I've been involved in several efforts around the world, um, to get well-being metrics into official statistics. In the UK, I worked a little bit with the New Zealand effort. The Canadians now have an effort. Other countries do, some countries in Latin America as well. And the idea is that what gets measured officially, what's in our official statistics, like GDP, which people focus on too much because there are no alternative measures. What I've found a lot is in very fast-growing countries, including in India, and also in China, is something I call the paradox of unhappy growth. So you have this very rapid growth that creates a lot of uncertainty and inequality, and people lose, they have drops in life satisfaction, increases in suicide, and all kinds of stuff before things kind of even out, right? But but the measures need to like complement each other. You need growth. Obviously the degrowth movement's kind of crazy because you cannot get all the things you want to, even if you were to spend all your societal, like public tax dollars on public goods, you can't generate that money if you don't have growth, right? So we need growth, but we also need measures of people's well-being as they go through, the processes, and as their economic changes or whatever else might be happening, people can be, suffering a lot while the economic numbers look great. And the US is the poster child of wealthy countries who have, after COVID, the US had the fastest economic growth of any wealthy country. And we had the highest levels of youth depression, child poverty, high levels of suicide, and falling levels of life satisfaction. So anybody that looks at all those things together will say, what's wrong? But if policymakers are only looking at the numbers, well, whoa, everything looks great, right? So I think it's a very simple change that can affect all kinds of different kinds of policies, everything from how you do tax cost benefit analysis, like there's an income effect to certain policies, but there's also a well-being effect, right? How you evaluate health policy, all sorts of things. This is just an addition. It's like having in a car, you have a gas gauge and you have other indicators, a speed gauge and whatever, and then you have like a red light that comes on when something's wrong that the other gauges aren't picking up. Well, that's what well-being metrics can do, and they're not expensive to collect. I mean, the questions take 30 seconds to answer. The UK has 4 questions: life satisfaction, meaning and purpose in life, and then positive affect, like, are you content daily or whatever? And then a negative affect one, are you worried or anxious, right? That's enough right there to be a very good gauge to complement what's going on economically. And it makes a huge difference. And it's not, it's not expensive. And it can spill over to different, kinds of policies. The UK has in their treasury work. The UK Treasury uses these metrics for cost benefit analysis. For economic stuff, they have a green book, and you can use well-being metrics to sorry, I've got to turn this off. You can use well-being metrics to sort of see how changes in the environment affect people's daily lives. So there are things that you can pick up on what is not going well in society or what is going well that complement your economic measures, but they don't always run in the same direction. And we could have avoided, unfortunately, I think, a lot of pain in the US society had we been doing that. If people had been measuring well-being when I wrote that book in 2017, we would not be where we are now, which is not a good place.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this important conversation on happiness, inequality, and the future of American dream. Dr. Carroll's work reminds us that hope is not just a feeling, but a form of capital that shapes lives and opportunities. As we live, let's carry forward the question at the heart of the book. How can we build a society where the pursuit of happiness is truly within reach for all, not just for a fortunate few? Thank you, Professor Carol Graham, for joining us and sharing such a thoughtful insights from your book. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Deepak. It was a pleasure.